Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Well, welcome to another episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. We are just having such a great time meeting plenty of interesting people in the world of technical education. And as we put together our list for the first 10 individuals that we knew that we needed to have record a podcast with us, there was one name that certainly rose all the way to the top. That is the name of my dear friend, Paul Perkins. Paul is the president and CEO of a company called Amatrol. Most of you probably already know Amatrol, but if you don't, you will be intimately familiar with it by the time we get done today. Paul, welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here today.
And I was mentioning to you as we rolled into the discussion, how much I know about you. We've had the opportunity to partner on so many amazing things that Amatrol has done over my 5 years with our current company, and certainly over the 40 years that we've been connected as two companies. But there's a lot of things that we don't know about Paul Perkins, and we really want to spend some time today digging into some of that. Everybody who knows you knows that you're an incredible leader in technical education, that you're recognized not just across the United States, but literally across the globe in terms of innovating, thinking of new and better ways to teach industrial skills and related skills. So we're really, really curious to know kind of what's under the hood and talk a little bit about how you ended up where you are and where you're going. So I think one question that's probably an easy question for us to start with, Paul, is just talk a little bit about how does somebody become president and CEO of a company like Amatrol? Tell us about your background.
Well, thank you, Matt. And actually, I grew up in the business, so it helps when you're a son of the boss. My family founded Amatrol in 1981, and before Amatrol existed, my mom and dad had started an engineering design firm in the mid-1960s that designed automation systems for industry. So from the early days, I've been around industrial automation, and I think that experience got me interested in machine design and pursuing a mechanical engineering degree, which I did. And after college, I went to work for a Fortune 500 company, but eventually came back to work for the family business when they decided to form Amatrol. My first job there was curriculum development. So I got involved using my technical skills and really, I think, developed a passion for teaching people and helping people understand things. And I probably spurred on by some of my personal experiences going through college. When I got to the end of my college experience, I realized that some of this could be a lot easier than it was. And so I was very motivated when I dug in writing materials to help us try and explain things better and help people be successful going into industrial technical skills type positions. When my father decided to retire in 2008, I took over the CEO position. It was just a gradual progression.
Gradual progression over what period of time, if I can ask?
1983 to 2008 was the time I came into the company in 83 and then became president in 2008.
Got it. And what a ride it has been. And looking back, a little bit before you got into your role at Amatrol or your career at Amatrol, you and I talk a lot about what influences young people's career pathways and how important those influences are and how important experiences are when students are in middle school and high school. Certainly your family and your parents were a huge influence on your pathway, as parents and in general are for so many of us. Were there other things that influenced your pathway to STEM, to engineering, to leadership, and so on?
Yeah, I think actually growing up with my dad, he was somebody who loved to create new things. And so he was always building some machine in his shop or modeling a machine that he was getting ready to design on a bigger scale. And I just found that very fascinating. And I always wanted to be a machine designer. I never envisioned that I would be in the world of education, but I think another element that blended into that was that my dad was somebody who always believed in giving back to the community. And even when he was starting his business and working 80 hours a week, he was somehow finding time to do all kinds of things to help people in the community. And I think he had people that certainly helped him along the way and wanted to find a way to give back. I do think that in education, there's just no better way to help somebody than to give them skills to help them be successful in a path in life. Getting involved, I think, in education was something that grew out of that combination of being interested in technology and being interested in helping people and volunteering in the community.
You mentioned the whole idea of building and watching your father build things when you were younger. Carrying on that hands-on learning opportunity, that kinesthetic learning opportunity is so very important. And that's certainly evident in the way that people, I believe, who find their way into the realm of technical education, eventually to endeavors like STEM and manufacturing, tend to be your hands-on kinesthetic learners, which is why that side of the work that you do is so very, very important. I think it's also interesting that you touch on the importance of giving back. And you're doing that a tremendous amount in your role as president and CEO of Amatrol, as you suggest, finding ways to influence career pathways, influence opportunities for people of all ages. That's so very important. I also happen to know that volunteerism in general is very important to you. And that's not just me recognizing it. In fact, if I recall correctly, the Indiana Chamber, a couple short years ago, I believe in 2018, named you the Indiana Volunteer of the Year, which has got to be just a tremendous honor. It's one thing for us to talk about volunteerism. It's another thing to be honored by an organization like that for volunteerism. But tell us a little bit, why is that so important to you? And what are some of the ways that your passion for being a volunteer have manifested themselves over the course of the recent decades?
Yeah, I've gotten involved in a lot of different activities over time, and part of it was motivated by my father and what he did. When you're working in a business that's growing, the ways sometimes that you carve out time is to justify it as it's a business activity. So I felt like I was doing something that tied in with my everyday work life. And so I've been involved with the State Chamber of Commerce, the National Governors Association, local chambers of commerce, but also groups like Goodwill that are very involved in helping get people skills to get new jobs. And then I've served on and continue to serve on foundations for various colleges in the region here. I think that the experiences that I've gotten out of that have really provided benefits in a two-way experience. I think not only have I been able to contribute some things to them, but they've contributed so much to me as a person. And one of them is learning from others. And in a lot of these volunteer activities, you're sitting around the table with people that might come from very different occupations. They could be attorneys or doctors or other types of business people, but when you hear them talk about solving a problem of any kind, usually a community problem, I just learned so much from them. I didn't get a bachelor's or master's degree in business, but I had to learn those skills on the job. And I actually think through volunteering, I have learned a tremendous amount about leadership and how to solve people problems. And I think it made it a lot more rewarding to do the work that I do today, because a good part of my day every week is doing something to engage in the volunteer community.
And the world is certainly a better place for all of the volunteer work that Paul Perkins has done over the years. You mentioned as we got going here, all the way back to 1983 with Amatrol, you've seen a tremendous amount. As you know, my father was involved in technical education for many, many decades. So I grew up in a house, maybe not too dissimilar from yours, where there was always some new contraption, always some new piece of equipment that was, floating into the house that my father was working with. And I think back to some of the technologies that manifested themselves 40 and 45 years ago. Some of the technologies students need to learn today are very similar, and in a lot of ways, some of those technologies are quite different. Can you tell us a little in nearly 4 decades? It's hard to believe that you've been with Amatrol. How has technical education evolved over that period of time?
It does seem like it's gone by very quickly. So, but I have vivid memories of working with your father years ago, and I might mention, Matt, that I think he's one of the most creative and caring people that have ever worked in technical education. And I think that's another reason why I've stayed in the business for so long, is that he and a handful of other people that we worked with when we came into this technical education world, I think just were really inspiring to me. And your dad had one of the greatest impacts on my professional life as I started in technical education. And I just can't thank him enough for the influence that he had on, I think, everything I am today. But back when I started working in technical education in the early 80s, it was a very different place than it is today. I think it was viewed as these were jobs for low achieving students. I had many principals and superintendents say that hey, these jobs aren't for our best students. These are for the students that we can't find anything else to do with, which is really a little dispiriting. But fortunately, there are a lot of people that didn't back away from it. But the skills, they're thought of for these areas were usually these types of occupations were low-level skills. Students weren't expected to have good math skills. They weren't expected to be able to read very well. Programs tended to be very specialized, so they were focused around a particular part of industry, like a mechanic job or an electrician job or a plumber's job. And I think that industry in general didn't view schools as being a place that they went to get people that could really do the job. And they generally felt that they had to do it themselves because schools were so disconnected from it. And I remember having conversations with many school leaders where they said, we'll never be able to catch up with industry. They're always going to be years ahead. And it was interesting that in the mid 1980s, the advent of robotics kind of changed their thinking about that. It got schools thinking, we've got to catch up on technology. And so I think through the 80s, there was a big race in the schools to not necessarily advance teaching methods as much as they were going to make investments to try and catch up the technology. And what they found is that was a big leap forward, but they also started to realize that they've got to advance the curriculum development process. And they started to realize this whole thing's moving way too fast for us to use the paradigm that we used years ago, where teachers develop their own curriculum, they write their own materials, they maybe choose a textbook, and they started to see that the only way that they would be able to keep up with the advance of technology was to buy things that were already prepackaged and then modify them as they needed for their applications. And that's when we actually, as a company, really transitioned from designing all these cool things for education to really seeing ourselves as a curriculum developer. And so we ramped up our investments in that. And over the course of the 90s, we increased the investment in that area by a factor of 10. And today it's the largest group that is in our company. And it truly is what drives our organization. And we even started developing interactive multimedia computer-based training in the 90s. And so it was an early technology, but we also could see the promise and the value of it, as well as having the content. Well, fast forward to today, from 2010 to 2020, I think we are coming to a very different place where people are starting to value technical education. And I think one of the reasons why is that we didn't produce enough people all these years with high enough skills that now industry is in a place where they don't have the people they need to be able to operate their businesses. And now industry is saying, we need help. We need to partner with education. And I think that's a big change that I've seen today versus where it was 30 years ago, is that industry realizes that they have to partner with education, that they can't get it done all themselves. And they want to help education. And I think that partnership has really been a great change. We still have a lot more work to do, because now that I think that community colleges are really having a lot of success in training people, we've got one problem. We don't have enough supply of people. And so there's a big focus right now on developing career and technical education at the high school and even the middle school stages. And industry is very, very interested in helping in that area, but it's going to take education leading the way to actually get it implemented. And I think that is starting to take place. I'm also starting to see that technical programs are not just seen as necessary, but they're seen as high quality occupations. They not only pay well, but they also involve a level of problem solving and thinking that we might have formerly thought would be the domain of engineering. And I think what's happened is over time, a lot of these occupations, the responsibilities have kind of blended across the lines. And some people refer to that blending between technicians and engineers as a technologist. And so I really believe today more industry, as they flatten out their hierarchy of supervision, they want people to be able to solve problems and analyze complex technical issues as close to the work as possible. And that's where the technicians are. And so today's technicians are technologists, which is why the compensation for them, I think, is so good, and it's going to continue to be good. And these people are also in a position where they can move on to supervision and getting bachelor's degrees. And it's not just seen as an alternative fork in the road where you can either go to college or you can go this technical route. This is really seen as part of an integrated continuum of education that people can develop, and essentially a career ladder that can take people from these technical occupations right up to the CEO position in a company.
I think you make a really, really good point. We talk quite a bit about the fact that manufacturing industry is still that place where you can start out sweeping the floor and end up running the company. And we can think of a whole number of different endeavors that people could choose where that probably isn't in the cards, and let folks use their imagination in terms of other industry sectors where it's really, really difficult to start out at the bottom and work your way all the way to the top. In manufacturing, everybody who has worked in manufacturing can tell stories like that. There's just tremendous numbers of people that have found their way to manufacturing and created incredible careers, all the way to CEO or jumping off anywhere along the line and having a really great family supporting, rewarding career. And I think as we look to the future of technical education and think about all the different career pathways, that's what we're seeing is the biggest change in high school, is that it's not the stigma that used to be attached to it. You can be in a technical education program, go direct to workforce. You can go to a community or technical college. You can go to a bachelor's degree program, or even use each of those as stepping stones. So many more options, and the careers are just so much more interesting. In my days of manufacturing, yes, we had a lot of technology, we had PLCs, we had robotics, but there was still, a lot of just kind of hand work and maybe not quite as rewarding work. And the work that we're asking people to do now in manufacturing, working with the kind of technologies that they do, so much more interesting. So couldn't agree with you more that that's certainly a huge, huge change. That's not the only world of education that's changing, is it? We're certainly high school and community college, but you have a formal engineering background. Graduated, I'll note for our audience, with honors from Georgia Tech a few years back with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. You lived in that experience. You've worked closely with 4-year degree engineering programs. How do you think those programs will change in the next decade?
That's actually a question I'm very passionate about answering, Matt, because, when I was in engineering school in the 70s, actually my first year there, it was really quite a shock, because I got to school thinking, hey, I'm going to see more really cool things like my dad has in his shop. And it was all chalkboards, which dates me a little bit, because not only did we not have a computer, we didn't have a whiteboard either. So it was a chalkboard. But that was viewed as the hands-on work of an engineer, was writing equations across a chalkboard. And interestingly enough, as I shared thoughts about that with some of my fellow students, freshmen that year, they were all saying, yeah, this isn't what I expected at all. The one student I met that was a civil engineer, he was really interested in building and construction type things. I had a friend that loved working on cars, and he chose mechanical engineering. Another friend was a ham radio operator, and that's why he got into electrical engineering. And then they got to school, and that's not what they saw. And they didn't get to see any of the hands-on. They were told, well, that's going to be later. And it really turned out to be very minimal through my years in school. And so it caused a lot of really good students to actually drop out of school because it didn't meet their expectations. It wasn't that they couldn't do it. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have had a shortage of engineers. But I think that co-op programs are one of the ways that schools have tried to mitigate that issue. And I became a co-op student. I fortunately knew somebody that owned this company that was willing to take me on. But it was what helped me really get the hands-on experience through school. And so that was a problem with engineering schools for many, many years. You got a good theoretical education, but you didn't get the hands-on. And so companies oftentimes would hire engineers feeling like they would have to wait for several years before they'd really be productive. I think today there have been a lot of really positive changes in that. I think we still have more ground to make up, but things like additive manufacturing, 3D printers, schools have made a big investment in that. And so students can not only think of a design, but actually create it and have something that's a working model that we couldn't do 30 years ago. But I think also schools have put a lot more investment into all kinds of laboratory devices that have helped really spark the interest of students. And as you pointed out, kinesthetic learning is something that is an interest that people have all across the population. It's not just relegated to a small percentage. And thankfully, engineers are getting a much better education today. I think they still have more development in engineering schools that would make it even better. But most companies today, when they hire an engineer, they want somebody who is going to hit the ground running. And the only way they do that is they've got to have the theoretical combined with the hands-on.
Absolutely. As you know, my wife Renee is a master's degree engineer, and she has said so many times if she had to do it over again, she would she would go back and even consider technical or community college degree as a way into engineering for the same reasons. Hands-on, kinesthetic, likes building, likes creating. And then we drop somebody into a classroom where it's 3 levels of calculus and who knows what else. And so getting students that context for what it is that they'll be learning as they get into an engineering program is so very important. So couldn't agree with you more on that. And maybe we'll see some disruption in that fashion over the course of the next several years in higher education and in engineering programs. Speaking of disruption, and you and I over the years have talked a lot about disruption, and I like seeing markets and programs and technologies disrupted. I know you have a passion for that as well. There was a little bit of a disruption these last 12 months that none of us saw coming, or at least I certainly didn't. And boy, what a different world we live in today than we did before COVID. What can you say about how COVID and the COVID crisis have affected technical education?
Well, it's been a crazy year. There have been some things that have happened that have been really unfortunate. The lost time that we've had for a group of students out there, they need every minute. This is part of their career development. We've lost some critical time. But I do think that there are some silver linings. We have seen an interest for many years in individualized learning plans because I think we realize that everybody's different. People have different circumstances and interests and learning abilities. And any time that you can customize a solution to somebody's needs, they're usually going to benefit from that. And I think schools have slowly been looking at different ways of individualized learning, how to use distance learning, maybe how people can learn in different places. And time is always a factor, is how do you get through a program in the limited time that you have? And if you can shorten that time, the persistence rates go up dramatically. That's really one of the silver linings of COVID. Schools have fast forwarded their thinking around computer-based internet online type learning, which is the ultimate solution in individualized learning experiences. And we're finding that all over the world right now, schools are looking at doing things years ahead. They've advanced that timetable dramatically. Maybe that'll be something that's going to help a lot of students catch up. Obviously, the other element to the learning is the hands-on part. And schools have come up with some really creative ways of providing for individualized learning because they've had to create laboratories where they're doing social distancing. They have kind of done a similar thing there that they're doing with online learning, and that is creating hands-on materials that are detailed enough that students can do them individually without an instructor leaning over their shoulder in an undistanced manner. It's an area that we're very involved in. So I do think that the ability to have an open lab where people can come in and work individually in their hands-on experiences to couple with that individualized online learning experience is something that a lot of schools are looking at. There are a number of schools that have already been doing that for some years. The idea of what they call the flipped classroom is really one of the manifestations of that. I think that's ultimately going to be a really good thing for students going forward.
So individualized learning, creative hands-on learning, open labs, flipped classrooms, all innovations that are taking place. Paul, I want to talk a little bit more about innovations. If we turn the clock forward the next 10 years or so, what changes do you predict in the world of technical education?
I think schools are on a really good path right now. But I think the idea that career and technical education is important, I think that's here to stay. And we're really just on the cusp of convincing the broader population of what a great opportunity this is. I think we've done a lot of work to build the engine, and now we've got to get people on the train. And I think we're going to do that. And I think it's going to be pretty exciting watching this go forward because there's a lot of people that are going to have really, really good lives. And I think they're going to have occupation that is going to have upward mobility, and they're not going to be worried about going back and having to retrain later. I think that the idea of hands-on learning is definitely something that's being infused into programs from engineering to technician to technologist. over the next 10 years, I believe we're going to come to a place where people are early on going to have a really good idea of all these careers and what their options are and where their best fit is. And I hope that we'll have a lot more people getting on the right track when they're in high school and not when they're 35 years old and realizing that they should have done something different in high school or college.
So lots and lots of changes in U.S. technical education over that period of time, with things like career exploration, exposing people to exciting careers in manufacturing, giving them the skills that they need to be successful. But really not just in the U.S. but across the globe. I'll tell you, Paul, one of my favorite days, probably the last several years, was getting up in Tokyo with you, with Brian Albrecht. We spent some time at the Japanese fish market. I still have some great photographs from that day, and then from there, I got on a plane to come back to Chicago. You got on a plane, I think, to go to Northern Europe.
Switzerland.
You've traveled the globe. You've met with people literally all over, speaking about technical education, innovating. I think at last count I heard, Amatrol was doing business in 53 countries. But what do you see globally? What can we here in the U.S. learn from the way other countries are approaching this whole idea of technical education, and how could we implement some of those best practices here in the States?
One of the things I've always been a big believer in is learning from others and seeing successful implementations of various ideas and then adapting them. And I think one of the areas that the U.S. schools have looked at most closely around the world has been this idea of work-based learning through apprenticeships. And certainly the European apprenticeship systems have been studied greatly by American education here in recent years. And I think we've learned both what to do and what not to do. The thing that we learned to do, we learned that work-based learning is really important, and bringing industry, education, and the students together in partnership is a good way to create a very, very highly talented and skilled individual. I think the thing that we've learned not to do is to not make it too rigid and not to put people on a track that they can't adjust from early on. And that's really been one of the mistakes that the European apprenticeship systems have done. Many of them have been very, very rigid, and they've been slow to change and slow to update. And one of the things I'm really encouraged by is I think we have looked at what's been done in Europe and taken the idea and then adapted it and improved on it here in the United States. There's a lot of different kinds of apprenticeship programs, and most of them have been highly adaptable. They've been increasing the skill sets that they're teaching and making it flexible for students. I do think another takeaway that I see globally looking around is that every single country right now is making investments, significant investments in career and technical education. They often call them TVET systems, technical vocational education systems. And every country is focused on this right now. And I think, to me, the takeaway is we're in a global race right now for developing our workforce system, and we really, really need to be on our game. One of the areas where other countries are learning a lot from us, interestingly enough, is the idea of individualized computer-based education. We are years ahead of the Europeans and most other countries in implementing this, because we have gone down a path of more of an individualized education approach, whereas they have been focused more on a master teacher that imparts the information to students as a cohort, as a group. And they're starting to realize that this individualized computer-based approach has some benefits that they can benefit their systems from as well.
So this innovation and learning from things that other countries are doing and implementing those things here, them learning from what we're doing. I love the idea of being in a global race, because it really highlights the importance and the urgency that we have here in the United States to do these things and do them now. Speaking of a sense of urgency, speaking of doing things now, Amatrol has never been one, at least as long as I've worked with you, to rest on your laurels, and a lot of people would look at you as a technical education learning company. In so many ways, you're really a technical innovation company as well, finding new ways to grow your business, to come up with new solutions. I want to turn our sights a little bit on some of those innovations just recently. So it's been a year or so now, maybe a little bit more than a year since your acquisition of DAC Worldwide. But I want to start with that one, Paul, and let's talk a little bit about what that's added to your product portfolio and how you see that helping grow your organization.
Well, DAC Worldwide is actually a 40-year-old company. It was founded by Glenn Warner and just outside Philadelphia, and their business is process control and electrical power generation, and they make a whole range of products for those industries. They were really attractive to us because, one, it fit in well with the types of technology that we're working with. They're just in a different industry. But I also think the philosophy and the vision of the founder was very much in line with how we look at things. He was a guy who cared deeply about other people and making a difference in the lives of people through education. So there was really a good fit for us. But we also saw an opportunity to advance some of the things that they were doing with some of the products and techniques that we already had. While they had some really great training devices, they weren't involved in computer-based education. And so we saw an opportunity to bring some of the techniques that we have developed for the world of manufacturing and logistics automation into power generation and process control.
Tremendous innovation in the markets that you just mentioned and automation. We're seeing a tremendous amount of that in the world of HVAC as well, are we not? And I know Amatrol has really set several goals around developing learning systems for that world, which is innovating like crazy. We think about Industry 4.0 and manufacturing. All of that technology is alive and well in the world of HVAC also. So talk to us a bit about the world of innovating in heating, ventilation, and air conditioning for Amatrol.
Well, we've been involved with HVAC for actually a very long time, but we've had a limited product line in that area. So they've been very good units, but it's only been a limited number of them. And so it's an industry that we've had interest in for quite some time because the technology that's used in HVAC is very similar to manufacturing. The difference is that we're moving energy or air, but it's essentially an electromechanical system. And today, HVAC systems are more often than not connected into a network with controllers and sophistication on the level of what we see in manufacturing. From a technical expertise standpoint, it really is an industry that fits very well with us. Another thing that was really attractive about HVAC is that it's a growing area. It can't be offshored. So if you're going to have your air conditioner fixed, you've got to have somebody that probably lives within 50 miles coming to repair it. And it really is a growing industry right now, especially because some of the modernization that's taking place with networking technology and software. And so we felt it's an area that really is an area that would also, just like DAC Worldwide, benefit from some of the technologies that we've developed in curriculum and interactive multimedia technology. And so we're working very vigorously right now on expanding the entire product line and adding modern interactive multimedia and curriculum techniques to that industry as well.
So expanding the product line, expanding into acquisitions, other versions of expansion also taking place at Amatrol. I understand that you're adding some square footage to your facility in Jeffersonville, Indiana. What can you tell us about that?
Right. As we've been expanding in all these different areas, we keep filling up the space that we have. We're actually adding another addition onto our facility here in Jeffersonville of 28,000 square feet. We're going to use it to put more development of HVAC and process control and some of the other technologies. Programmers are always in high demand, and we're constantly expanding in that area. And we're also investing in new types of automation equipment in our own manufacturing facilities. So we have autonomous robots running around our facility now, and we have our eyes on more types of technology to use ourselves. When you're a company that designs training programs to help people to learn how to maintain it, it does make you think that you might have an opportunity to use the technology yourself. So it's been kind of fun doing that. And we're constantly looking for new things, new toys to put into our facility.
Yeah, I can tell you one of the favorite trips I take is down to Jeffersonville, Indiana. I get to your plant several times a year, Paul, and I can tell you from experience that you're definitely one who practices what you preach. And as those new technologies have come of age in manufacturing, you've led or implemented them along the way. So certainly an important part of continuing to grow a business and continuing to remain relevant and create a showpiece as well for people that come and see not just the amazing learning systems, but also the amazing manufacturing technology that's alive and well at Amatrol. So changing gears just a little bit, a couple cerebral questions. One of the questions we love to ask our guests is if you could change just one thing about the world of technical education, if you had one thing you think would have the greatest impact, one thing you could do that would make tech ed better, what would that thing be?
There are really two things that come to mind, Matt. So I'm really frustrated. You're only giving me one. But
Well, give me two and I'll pick the best. How's that?
Okay. But they actually tie into each other, I think. And one of them is something we touched on earlier, and that is technical learning and academic learning have been separated for so long. And now that we're seeing the value of technical learning, I think we still very often have it as a separate component from academic learning. And I just think that one of the ways that we're going to capture the interest of more students into these careers is to blend academics and technical learning together. The more that we do that, the less frequently that we have a math class and a physics class and a tech ed class separated from each other. If we can blend things like that, we're probably going to get a lot more students more interested in these careers because they're going to get more exposure. I think we're also probably going to get a lot better performance academically from them because they're going to see the application of it. And for a lot of people, their desire to learn these things really stems from seeing relevance. And when they can't see it, they don't do it. And what ties into that is that I would love to see a world where students in 8th or 9th grade are so well exposed to all the career opportunities and the technologies, and they know enough about it that they've got a pretty good idea of where they want to go. Or if they don't, they know how they're going to go about making those decisions. Or maybe they've narrowed it down to a couple of things and they're going to go through high school and continue to reevaluate and learn more. And by the time that they are at the end of high school, they really have their path set in life. Working with community colleges all my life, I am gratified that they're helping people who are 30, 35 years old come back and get on a good track. Thank goodness that they are there doing that work. But wouldn't it be great if that person got on that track at 18? And they still might be at the community college, but they wouldn't have wasted 10 or 15 years of their lives doing something else. And so that would be my wish for technical education.
Perfect. We're having a great conversation with Paul Perkins, President and CEO of Amatrol today. We've talked about the past of technical education and about the future of technical education, talked about the past of Amatrol and where some of Amatrol's innovation is going in the future. We've talked about the past of four-year engineering programs and in the future of four-year engineering programs. We've also talked about the past of Paul Perkins. I think we started there. The one thing we haven't talked about yet is the future of Paul Perkins. And I can tell you that, if the world stopped today, Paul, the influence that you have had on the world of technical education, industry in the Midwest, it's just been absolutely phenomenal. And you would leave behind the most incredible legacy that one could even think of. Now, we're all hoping that it doesn't end there, that we've got another several decades ahead of us. But as you look to the future, what does the future hold for you personally and in terms of your business opportunity and your career?
Well, I love what I'm doing now, and I can't think of any better place to make a contribution. I feel like the work that we are doing and helping schools be successful is making a difference for so many different students. And I hope that I get to do this for many, many years in the future. I'm inspired by some of the business and government leaders around the world today that are in their late 70s and 80s and even 90s that are coming to work every day and loving what they do. And that really inspires me. And I think that, we hopefully can just keep reaching more students doing what we're doing now.
And we hope so too. Tremendous runway ahead of Paul Perkins for sure. We also, one of our traditions here on the Tech Ed podcast is to turn the tables a little bit and let the guests pummel us with a couple questions. So if you have any stumpers for me, if they get really difficult, I'll hand them off to our producer, Melissa Martin, but would love to hear what's on your mind from that standpoint.
Well, Matt, I know that you traveled and spent a great deal of time with education and business leaders around the Midwest, especially. What developments are you seeing that you think are going to have the most impact on technical education going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I would tell you it's all about the idea of convergence. And you touched on a couple of these. You talked about the convergence of academic and technical learning. We see tremendous convergence between industry and education in ways that we didn't see, even 5 or 10 years ago. And so that's probably when I point to the biggest changes that we've seen. Obviously, technology is huge, but we're starting to understand that it's okay for industrial employers and educators to sit together at the same table, to admit that they don't necessarily speak each other's language, to admit that they don't completely understand each other. But if they put the future of their communities and their students at the top of the list, it is amazing the types of innovations that can come from that. So we're seeing more opportunities with certainly work-based learning. You mentioned apprenticeships. So we think that is going to continue and morph. I think the standard registered apprenticeship for the right candidate is a really, really good pathway. but it's also a really, really big commitment to make at a pretty young age, depending on when you're making that commitment. So work-based learning opportunities are going to transition, I think, pretty significantly. You'll see more and more of those. We're seeing more and more industrial employers stepping up and supporting their local high schools and community colleges, not just with money. And usually the money follows things like serving on advisory boards, even high school advisory boards, and advising on what types of technologies they want to see in their tech ed programs. But what also comes with that is industrial employers realizing what they don't know about technical education, how education is. I mean, I worked in both spaces, so have you. It is in some ways easier to get things done, but in some ways there's just a little bit more, there's a lot more rules. And if you're running a small manufacturing company as I did, we didn't have a lot of rules to follow. As long as you were following the regs and the local ordinances and your EPA requirements and what have you, everybody was working safely. You had a lot of flexibility. Our educators don't have that kind of flexibility, and it's sometimes hard for an industrial employer to realize that you can't just decide on Monday that you're going to change your curriculum at the end of the week. It's not the world that they live in. So as that dialogue takes place, I think we're getting closer and closer to that convergence between industry and education, and some really interesting partnerships and results are starting to flow out of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Matt. So one of the things that certainly I've been challenged by in my career is having to learn new things. So I started as a mechanical engineer, thinking that's what machine design was all about. Suddenly realized the electrical was perhaps an even more important part of that, and certainly it's well recognized today. So I've had to learn a lot over time, and that's actually been one of the things I love most about the work that I do, and it keeps me interested. And I know you run a pretty good sized company today. I'm just wondering, what kind of challenges are you finding with learning new things and keeping your people up to date?
With innovation and what we call industry 4.0, or I call the exponential economy, you think about where our smartphone technology was 15 years ago versus where it is today. And I used to have one of those big white iPods with the little transmitter that went on top of it. I could listen to music on my stereo in my car. That was 15 years ago. And you think about now, every one of us has a smartphone that does that and a bazillion other things. Technology is changing at a rate that I don't know that people appreciate compared to that rate that maybe it changed 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so I think in the past we maybe lived in a world where if you learn what you needed to do for your job in the year 1920, by the year 1940, yeah, some things had changed, but a lot of that was probably the same. We don't live in that world anymore. And so the truth of the matter is, it's not a question of whether we decide to be a lifelong learner or decide not to be. It's really, if we're going to remain relevant in our career, if we're going to have skills that people are going to continue to want to pay us to utilize, we have to hone those skills over time, or they'll just become obsolete like anything else becomes obsolete, and our opportunities will be tremendously limited. We came to an epiphany about a year and a half ago, I think, give or take. We do a lot of work with industrial employers. We've talked a lot about education today, but I know Amatrol is also really involved in industry, upskilling the current workforce. And we preach a lot to industrial employers about the importance of upskilling the workforce, about getting back to that time 40 years ago when the average industrial employee received 100 hours a year of skills-based learning at work provided by their employer. And we've gotten so far away from that. So we preach about that, but we came to a realization that we weren't really living up to that ourselves. And so our entire team now has been spending time as lifelong learners in formal learning programs, earning certifications. I know you've been really involved with the Smart Automation Certification Alliance. I'm a huge advocate for that organization, as you know. I've earned their first 2 associate level credentials. Melissa, who's our producer, has earned them as well. And I actually wrote a magazine column. I still write columns for Products Finishing and Production Machining magazine. And the topic of my column this month was, I wish I had learned those things 20 years ago. I wish I had gone through those courses 20 years ago, because it would have made me a better manufacturing executive. And I think going through the courses that prepared us for the SACA exam, which by the way, I don't mind saying were provided by Amatrol, has made our sales and business development people better business development people. It's made our technicians better technicians, and it's made our administrative team and our marketing team better at what they do, because they have a better appreciation for manufacturing technology and how it's evolving. So great question. Lifelong learning isn't an option anymore. It's an absolute, it's table stakes if you're going to remain relevant in your career. And we're huge believers in that, and we'll continue to advocate for it.
Fantastic.
All right. 2 great questions from Paul Perkins this afternoon. And in wrapping things up, Paul, thank you so much for taking some time with us today. As you know, I have tremendous respect for your company, even more respect for you individually, if that's possible. It's just been incredible working with you these last several years. Look forward to the next several decades together, and really want to thank you on behalf of our audience for sharing so many insights and so much of your wisdom and knowledge with us today.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you like this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.